Alrighty. Sorry about the delay. Thank you for tuning in to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggith, and today we're going to be doing the final installment, the thrilling climax of Behemoth, Book 2, Seppuku, by Peter Watts, and incidentally, the final installment of the Rifters trilogy as a whole. Yes, it was technically 4 books. But Behemoth Book 1, Betamax, and Behemoth Book 2, Seppuku, are intended to be taken as a contiguous whole. So, but it worked out well. Listen, think of it this way. If it hadn't been 4 books, I wouldn't have gotten to the final part of Acceptance. I wouldn't have gotten around to Acceptance by Jeff Vandermeer as early as I did. So there. You'd be listening to that right now. Anyway, so previously on, rumors of Ricketts' death were greatly exaggerated. Seppuku doesn't necessarily kill you. It does make you badly, badly sick, but instead it rewrites your entire genetic code and how you're built chemically to be something that Behemoth can't really deal with. Basically, if I understand correctly, it's kind of replacing mitochondria, or at least replacing the role of mitochondria in some ways. This explains the weird insects, bug, arthropod critters that have been showing up with too many limbs. Um, so who fed Lenie and Ken the line about, oh, it's Seppuku's bad, they're trying to kill us faster, and they were like, yeah, no, that's believable. That's believable. Sounds like human nature. Well, it was Achilles Desjardins, and he's looking an awful lot like a loose end, and you know what Ken Lubin does to those. He ties them in a knot. So this is a cover from the 2019, I believe, Russian edition of Behemoth. Yes, the Russian edition of Behemoth from 2019 by a guy named an artist, might not be a guy, an artist named Yemelyanov. And Watts says the following. It's about time Lubin got his own cover. I gotta say, Yemelyanov's take on Behemoth give Vaichik's cover a real run for the money. Covers a real run for the money. Totally different aesthetics, but I love them both. Yeah, they're both pretty good. Um, Vaichik, for instance, is the one who did that one of Lenie holding uh, what's her name? Oh, jeez, the ever villainous corporate woman whose name is eluding me at this very moment. But I can't remember her name, and that is not very productive at all. It'll come to me. Has the daughter. Anyway, she dies at the end of the first book of Behemoth. Um, and it's the one of Lenie. It's very green, and Lenie's holding her. It's that scene from like right around the end of the book. It's very good. Very touching scene for me because it develops Lenny's character as well as develops the corporate woman's character as well. Oh my God, I am losing my mind. Why can I not remember her name? This is embarrassing. Give me a sec. This is really quite embarrassing indeed. Oh boy. It'll come to me. And until it does, I've got to go and find her name by reading the book. Give me a sec. Patricia Rowan. There we go. Pat Rowan. Patty. Patricia Rowan. Yes. Anyway, um, That was Vajic's work, if you remember that one. It's in there. It's in the playlist. Anyway, this is by a different artist entirely, and I think it's pretty good. What's happening in this scene will make sense probably this coming chapter. This is this is the climax right here. This is the big deal, and then the end. So, without further ado, oh, that's right. Ken Lubin last time was able to have his nice George of the Jungle or Tarzan moment. Unfortunately, it cost him his eyes, which is bad because now he can't really see. I mean, he can see things. He can see like digital overlays of electronic schematics and whatnot, but he can't see. So he needs Lennie along, which was not the plan originally. And they are going to deal with the Achilles Desjardins problem. Who would have thought that hooking up a chemically induced sociopath would to all the world's power at once and given carte blanche as to how to use it would turn out to be a bad thing? Who knew? I could never have guessed. Such a shock to me. I am enchantmented. All right, with that, let's get cracking. And not just the Leviathan of the Deep. All right, so this is going to be a long-ish stream. Not too long, though. Book divides itself up into chunklets pretty nicely. Okay. Bastille. Sudbury rose in the night like a luminous tumor. Its core glowed from within, faintly by dryback standards, but bright as day to Lenie Clarke, a walled, claustrophobic cluster of refitted skyscrapers in an abandoned wasteland of suburbs and commercial zones. The static field was obvious by inference. The new buildings and the grafted retrofits, the galls of living space wedged into the gaps between buildings, all extended to the inner edge of the field and no farther. Like metastasis, constrained under glass, Sudbury had grown into a hemisphere. They cut through from the east. Clarke's diveskin squirmed in the field like a slug in a flame. Charged air transformed the rotors into whirling vortices of brilliant blue sparks. She found the effect oddly nostalgic. It seemed almost bioluminescent, like microbes fluorescing in the heat of a deep-sea vent. For a moment she could pretend that some airborne variant of St. Elmo's fire trailed from those spinning blades. But only for a moment. There was only one microorganism up here worth mentioning, and it was anything but luminous. Then they were through, sniffing westward through the upper reaches of the Sudbury core. City canyon walls loomed close on either side. Sheet lightning sparked and flickered along the strip of sky overhead. Far below, intermittently eclipsed by new construction, some vestigial rapid-trans line ran along the canyon floor like a taut copper thread. She resumed loading clips from the open backpack at her feet. Lubin had toured her through the procedure somewhere over Georgian Bay. Each clip contained a dozen slug grenades, color-coded by function: flash, gas, shipworm, clusterfuck. They went into the belt and holster arrangement draped over her thigh. Lubin spared a prosthetic glance. "Don't forget to seal that pack when you're done." How's your tape? She undid her top and checked the dive skin beneath. A broad X of semi-permeable tape blocked off the electrolysis intake. Still sticking. She zipped the dryback disguise back into place. Doesn't this low-altitude stuff bother the local authorities? Not those authorities. His tone evoked the image of blind eyes turning. Evidently, derms and antidotes and gutted bodies bought more than mere transportation. Clarke didn't push the issue. She slid one last cartridge home and turned her attention forward. A couple of blocks ahead, the canyon ended in open space. So that's where he is, she murmured. Lubin throttled back so that they were barely drifting forward. It spread out before their approach like a great dark coliseum, a clear zone carved from the claustrophobic architecture. Lubin brought the Sikorsky Bell to a dead stop 300 meters up, just short of that perimeter. It was a walled moat, 2 blocks on a side. A lone skyscraper, a fluted, multifaceted tower, rose from its center. A ghostly crown of blue lights glowed dimly from the roof. Everything else was dead and dark, 65 floors with not so much as a pane alight. Patchwork foundations scarred the empty ground on all sides, the footprints of demolished buildings that had crowded the neighborhood back in happier times. She wondered what dryback eyes would see, if drybacks ever ventured here after dark. Maybe, when Sudbury's citizens looked to this place, they didn't see the entropy patrol at all. Maybe they saw a haunted tower, dark and ominous, full of skeletons and sick, crawling things. Buried in the guts of the 21st century, besieged by alien microbes and ghosts in the machinery, could people be blamed for rediscovering a belief in evil spirits? Maybe they're not even wrong, Clarke reflected. Lubin pointed to the spectral lights on the parapet. A landing pad rose from that nimbus, a dozen smaller structures holding court around it. Freight elevators, ventilation shacks, the housings of retracted lifter umbilicals. Clarke looked back skeptically. No. Surely they couldn't just land there. Surely there'd be defenses. Lubin was almost grinning. Let's find out. I'm not sure that's... He hit the throttle. They leaped into empty, unprotected space. Out of the canyon, they banked right. Clarke braced her hands against the dash. Earth and sky rotated around them. Suddenly, the ground was 300 meters off her shoulder, an archaeological ruin of raised foundations. And 2 black circles, meters across, staring up at her like the eye sockets of some giant cartoon skull. Not empty, though. Not even flat. They bulged suddenly from the ground, like the exposed polar regions of great buried spheres. What are those? She asked. No answer. Clarke glanced across the cockpit. Lubin was holding his binoculars one-handed between his knees, holding his pince-nez against their eyepieces. The apparatus stared down through the ventral canopy. Clarke shuddered inwardly. How to deal with the sense of one's eyes floating half a meter outside the skull? I said, she began again, superheating artifact. Soil grains explode like popcorn. What would do that? Landmine? He shook his head absently, his attention caught by something near the base of the building. Particle beam. Orbital cannon. Her gut clenched. If he's got... Ken, what if he sees... Something flashed, sodium bright, through the back of her skull. Clockwork stuttered briefly in her chest. The Sikorsky Bell's controls hiccoughed once, in impossible unison, and went dark. I think he has, Lubin remarked as the engine died. Thanks for tuning in while you could, Warren Steele. It's okay. Watch it afterwards. It's fine. They're all uploaded anyway. So it's good. Wind whistled faintly through the fuselage. The rotor continued to whoop, whoop, whoop overhead, its unpowered blades slapping the air through sheer inertia. There was no other sound but Lubin, cursing under his breath as they hung for an instant between earth and sky. In the next, they were falling. Clarke's stomach rose into her throat. Lubin's feet slammed pedals. Tell me when we pass 60 meters. They arced past dark facades. What? I'm blind. Lubin's teeth were bared in some twisted mix of fear and exultation. His hands gripped the joystick with relentless futility. Tell me when... The 10th floor! Tell me when we pass the 10th floor! Part of her gibbered, senseless and panic-stricken. The rest struggled to obey, tried desperately to count the floors as they streaked past, but they were too close. Everything was a blur, and they were going to crash. They were going to crash right into the side of the tower, but suddenly it was gone, swept past stage left, its edge passing almost close enough to touch. Now the structure's north face coasted into view, the focus sharper with distance, and... Oh God, what is that? Some unaffordable, awe-struck piece of her brain murmured, it can't be, but it was, black and toothless and wide enough to swallow legions. A gaping mouth in the building's side. She tried to ignore it as they fell past, forced herself to focus on the floors beneath, count from the ground up. They were diving straight past that impossible maw. They were diving into it. Let now! She yelled. For a second that went on forever, Lubin did nothing at all. The strangest sensations in that elastic moment. The sound of the rotor, still impossibly awhirl through luck or magic or sheer stubborn denial, its machine gun rhythm dopplered down like the slow, distant heartbeat of a receding astronaut. The sight of the ground racing up to spike them into oblivion. Sudden, calm resignation, a recognition of the inevitable. We're going to die. And a nod, sadly amused, to the irony that the mighty Ken Lubin, who always thought 10 steps ahead, could have made such a stupid fucking mistake. But then he yanked on the stick, and the chopper reared back, losing its nerve at the last moment. Suddenly she weighed 100 tons. They faced the sky. The world skidded around them, earth and glass and far-off cloud rolling past the windshield in a blurry jumble. For one astonishing moment they hovered. Then something kicked them hard from behind. From behind, the sound of cracking polymers and tearing metal. They lurched sideways, and that magical rotor slashed the earth and stopped dead, defeated at last. Lenie Clarke stared up, mad-eyed, at the great monolith leaning crazily against the night sky, descending along with the darkness to devour her. Lenie. She opened her eyes. That impossible mouth still yawned overhead. She squeezed her eyes shut, held them closed for a second. Tried again. Oh, not a mouth after all. A great charred hole part way up the north facade, stretching across 10 gutted floors or more. Rio, she realized. They never repaired the damage. The roof of the building was clearly visible, straight ahead through the forward windshield. The lights up there had gone out. The whole building seemed to lean to the left. The chopper's nose was twisted up at a 30-degree angle, like some mechanical mole that had breached from the earth and torqued on its axis. Their ride was sockeye. The tail boom must have either crumpled at their backs or snapped off entirely. Pain in her chest and arms. There was something wrong with the sky. That was it. It was dark. They were in a clave, where static field generators hummed endless electricity into the air. Sudbury's sky should have been flickering. Before they'd fallen, it had been. Lenie! Was that a pulse? She wondered. Can you move? She focused and located the source of the pain. Lubin's backpack, hard and lumpy, clutched tightly as life itself against her chest. It must have risen from the floor during the dive. She must have grabbed it in midair. She remembered none of it. The slit along its top puckered like a mouth in her embrace, affording glimpses of the stuff inside, an angular jumble of tools and ordnance pressing painfully into her flesh. She willed her grip to relax. The pain subsided. I think I'm okay. Are you? He looked blindly back at her through sand-blasted eyes. An image from the fall came to her, unregistered until now. Lubin's pince-nez, sailing gracefully toward the back of the cabin. Clarke unbuckled and twisted to look behind her. Sudden, sharp pain splintered down her spine like cracking ice. She cried out. Lubin's hand was on her shoulder. What? Whip... Whiplash, I think. I've had worse. She settled back in her seat. No point in looking for the pince-nez anyway. The pulse would have fried them as thoroughly as it had the chopper. You're blind again, she said softly. I packed another pair. The knapsack's shielded. Its mouth grinned at her, zipper-toothed. Realization crashed over her in a sickening wave. Oh, fuck, Ken. I forgot to zip it up. He waved away her apology. You'll be my eyes. Is the cabin breached? What? Any breaks in the fuselage? Anything big enough for you to crawl through, say? Any Clarke turned again, carefully. Pain fainted to the base of her skull, but stopped short of outright attack. No, the rear bulkhead's crumpled to shit, but... Good. Do you still have the pack? She opened her mouth to answer, and remembered two carbonized mounds staring into the sky. Focus, Len. Do you? It doesn't matter, Ken. It matters a great... We're dead, Ken. She took a deep, despairing breath. He's got orbital cannon, remember? Any second now, he'll just... And there's not a fucking thing we can... Listen to me! Suddenly, Lubin was close enough to kiss. If he was trying to kill us, we'd be dead already, do you understand? I doubt he's even willing to bring his satellites online at this point. He doesn't want to risk losing them to the shredders. But he already... The pulse didn't come from orbit. He must have packed half the floors in that building with capacitors. He's not trying to kill us. He's only trying to soften us up. He thrust out his hand. Now where's the pack? She handed it over, numbly. Lubin set it on his knee and rummaged inside. He's not trying to kill us. Lubin had made that claim before, laid it out as part of his working hypothesis en route from Toro Milton. Clarke wasn't entirely sure that recent events bore him out, especially since... A flicker of motion, just to the right. Clarke turned and gasped, the pain of that motion forgotten in an instant. A monstrous face stared back through the bubble of the canopy, centimeters away, a massive black wedge of muscle and bone. Small dark eyes glinted from deep sockets. The apparition grinned, showing sawtooth serrations embedded in jaws like a leg-hold trap. In the next moment, it had dropped out of sight. What? Lubin's face panned back and forth. What do you see? I think it used to be a dog, Clarke said, her voice quavering. I think they all did, Lubin told her. Tilted at the sky, she hadn't seen them arrive. She had to look down to see forward, and now, through the ventral bubble between her knees, over the edge of the door if she strained from her seat, the darkness seethed on all sides. The apparitions did not bark or growl. They made no sound at all. They didn't waste energy on brute animal rage, didn't throw themselves slavering against the hull to get at the soft meat inside. They circled like silent sharks. Boosted light stripped nothing from these creatures. They were utterly black. How many? Lubin ran one hand again across his grenade pistol. The ammo belt lay across his knees, one end still trailing down into the knapsack between his feet. 20, 30, at least. Oh, Jesus, Ken, they're huge. They're twice as big as you are. Clarke fought rising panic. Lubin's pistol came with three cartridge slots and a little thumb wheel to choose between them. He felt out flash, shipworm, and clusterfuck from the belt and slotted them in. Can you see the main entrance? Yes. What direction? How far? About 11 o'clock, maybe 80 meters. Might as well be 80 light years. What's between there and here? She swallowed. A pack of rabid monster dogs waiting to kill us. Besides that, we're on the edge of the main drag, paved, old foundations either side, pretty much raised and filled. And then, hoping he wasn't headed where she feared, hoping she could deflect him if he was, she added, no cover. Can you see my binocs? She turned carefully, torsion and injury in uneasy balance. Right behind you. The strap's caught up in the cleat over the door. He abandoned his weapon long enough to disentangle the binoculars and hand them over. Describe the entrance. Range-finding and thermal were dead, of course. Only the raw optics still worked. Clarke tried to ignore the dark shapes in the blurry foreground. Bank of glass doors, 8 of them. They're set into this shallow indentation in the facade, CSIRA logo on top. Ken, what's behind the doors? A vestibule a few meters deep, and then... Oh, last time there was another set of doors further in, but those are gone now. There's some kind of heavy slab instead, like a big drop gate or something. Looks pretty featureless. What about the side walls of the vestibule? Concrete or biolite or something. Just walls. Nothing special. Why? He tightened the ammo belt around his waist. That's where we go in. She shook her head. No, Ken. No fucking way. Dropgate's the obvious defense. More sensible to go around than hit it head on. We can't go out there. They'll tear us apart. I didn't come all this way to let a pack of dogs pin me down 80 meters from the finish line. Ken, you're blind. They won't know that. He held up his pistol, and they'll know what this is. Appearances matter. She stared at his corroded eyes, the oozing flesh of his face. How are you going to aim? The same way we landed. You'll give me bearings. Lubin felt around in the pack and pulled out the Heckler & Koch. Coke? Take this. She did, unbelieving. We keep the dogs back long enough to get in through the wall. The rest of the plan doesn't change. Dry-mouthed, Clarke watched them, circling. What if they're armored? What if they're wired? They'll be pulse-proof, no electronics, the usual tweaks and nothing more. He zipped up the knapsack and slung it across his back, tightening the straps around shoulders and waist. Are these guns pulse-proof? A sudden disquieting memory rose to the surface of her thoughts, machinery in her chest, hiccoughing. What about our implants? Bioelectric. EMP doesn't bother them much. What's the H&K set on? She checked. Conotoxins. Ken, I've never even fired a gun before. My aim will be better than mine. Lubin clambered back down into the tilted cabin behind their seats. You may get off easily. I rather suspect they'll be focusing on me. But gloves, he said, sealing his to the gauntlets beneath his clothing. Clarke pulled her gloves on over shaking hands. Ken, we can't just. He paused, fixed her with his sightless eyes. You know, I liked you better when you were suicidal. You weren't nearly so chicken shit. She blinked. What? I'm losing patience, Len. 5 years of guilt-ridden self-pity should be enough for anyone. Was I wrong about you? Were you just wallowing all this time? Do you want to save the world or not? I. This is the only way. Is there anything you wouldn't do, then, for the chance to take it all back? Back then, the answer had been obvious. It was obvious now. Freezing, familiar determination reignited inside her. Her face burned. Lubin nodded, only his eyes blinded. He sat on the floor, his back against the bulkhead behind Clarke's seat. Nose plugs. They'd improvised them en route, little wads of the same semi-permeable tape that blocked her intake. Clarke stuffed one up each nostril. I blow a hole in the hull, Lubin said, inserting his own. That drives the dogs back long enough for us to exit the chopper. Once we're outside, point me at the main entrance. That's 12 o'clock. All target bearings will be relative to that, not to where I happen to be facing at any given time. Do you understand? She nodded, forgetting for an instant. Then, yes. They'll charge as soon as we're in the open. Call it. Close your eyes when I give the word. I'll be using the flash grenades. They'll be incapacitated for at least 10 seconds. Shoot as many as you can. Keep moving. Got it. Anything else? Sorry. Got it. Anything else? Lose the gloves once we're free of the heat. The sight of dive skin might start him thinking. Patient killers paced just past the bleh. That one caught me by surprise. Patient killers paced just past the canopy. They seemed to look her in the eye. They smiled, showing teeth the size of thumbs. Just the usual tweaks, she thought, giddy and terrified. She braced her back against the canopy, raising her gloved hands to protect her face. We can do this, Lubin said softly. Just remember what I told you. He's not trying to kill us. She wondered just who that applied to. You really think he expects us to survive? Lubin nodded. But does he know you're blind? I doubt it. He pointed his gun across the cabin. The thumb wheel locked onto clusterfuck. Ready? This is it, Lenie girl. Your one shot at redemption. Don't fuck it up. Go, she said, and shut her eyes. Lubin fired. Clarke's lids glowed sudden, bloody orange. Her dive skin took most of the heat from the neck down, but in that moment it was as if someone had thrust her head into a kiln. She swore the heat blasted the very skin from her face. She clenched her teeth and held her breath and cursed the chances Lubin wouldn't take. It might tip him off if he sees our hoods. The air roared and crackled, sizzled with spatterings of liquid metal. She could hear the crack of Lubin's pistol firing again at her side. She realized, distantly amazed, that the pain was gone. Fear and adrenaline had swept it away in an instant. The world dimmed beyond her eyelids. She opened them. A hole gaped in the side of the chopper. Soft alloy glowed intermittently at its edges. Acrylic peeled and blackened. Chunks of shredded canopy guttered on the floor, one scant centimeter from her left foot. Lubin fired a third time. A spread of incendiary needles shot through the breach and into the darkness beyond, a tiny, devastating meteor shower. Clusterfucks were designed to sow 1,000 lethal pinholes across a wide area, but there'd been little chance to disperse across the meager width of the cabin. Almost 2 meters of solid fuselage had been reduced to silvery chaff and blown outward. A fan of dispersed wreckage steamed and congealed on the ground outside. "How big is the hole?" Lubin snapped over ambience. "Meter and a half." She choked and coughed on the stink of scorched plastic. "Lots of little bits past—" Too late. Lubin, blindly brazen, had already launched himself through the hole. He sailed over the scree nearest the threshold and hit the ground shoulder first, rolling to his feet in an instant. A lozenge of hot metal smoldered like a branding iron against his left shoulder blade. Lubin writhed, reached around and pushed it loose with the muzzle of his gun. It dropped to the ground, tarry with half-melted copolymer. A ragged hole smoked on Lubin's shirt. The injured dive skin beneath squirmed as if alive. Clarke gritted her teeth and dove after him. A bright spark of pain, needle-sharp and needle-fine, ignited briefly on her forearm as she sailed through the breach. In the next instant, blessed cool air washed over her. She landed hard and skidded. 2 great carcasses twitched and burned before her, grinning behind charred lips. She scrambled to her feet, peeling off her gloves. Sure enough, the rest of the pack had retreated for the moment, holding the perimeter at a more discreet distance. Lubin swept his weapon back and forth, pure threat display. "Lenie! Here, 2 down!" She reached his side, pointing her H&K at the circling horde. "The others backed off." She turned him clockwise. "Entrance that way, 12 o'clock. Remember," she told herself. "Bearings from the entrance, bearings from the—" He nodded. "How far are the dogs?" He held his pistol two-handed, arms extended, elbows slightly bent. He looked almost relaxed. 25 meters, maybe. Bearings from the entrance. Smart. Just past effective range. Bearings from... Your range is 25 lousy meters? Widespread. It made sense, of course. A useful cheat for a poor marksman, and blind was as poor as it got. The catch was a needle cloud so widely dispersed that distant targets passed through it untouched. "Try yours." Clarke aimed. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She fired once, twice. The H&K bucked in her grip. Its bark was surprisingly soft. The enemy stared back, undiminished. "Missed. Unless they're immune, Ken. You said they were tweaked." Sudden motion to the right, a rush along the flank. 2 o'clock! Clarke hissed, firing. Lubin turned and shot a firestorm of needles. 8! He swung and fired again, barely missing Clarke as she ducked beneath his outstretched arms. Splinters of fire laced the ground to both sides. 3 more dogs were down, lacerated by flaming shrapnel. 2 more, fitfully ignited, fled back out of range. Still, the pack was mute. The perimeter boiled with silent anger. She kept her own weapon up, for all the good it would do. 3 down, 2 injured. The rest of them are holding back. Lubin panned left, right. This is wrong. They should be charging. They don't want to get shot. You said they were smart. Attack dogs too smart to attack. Lubin shook his head. No, this is wrong. Maybe they just want to keep us pinned here, Clarke said hopefully. Maybe. Something rang faintly in her skull, not so much heard as felt. An itch, shrill and irritating. "Ah," Lubin said softly. "That's more like it." The change was too subtle for sight and too fundamental. No motion sensor, no image analysis subroutine would have been able to read the signs. But Lenie Clarke knew it instantly, on some primal level that predated humanity itself. Something in the gut that had never been forgotten. Something in the gut. What? Yeah, no, it's just missing had. That, rather. Something in the gut that had never. What? So the sentence reads, something in the gut had never forgotten in all these million years. It's got to be something that the gut had never forgotten in all these million years. Yeah, sorry. Something that the gut had never forgotten in all these million years. On all sides, many creatures merged suddenly together into one, into a vast seething entity with myriad bodies and a single merciless focus. Lenie Clarke watched it leap toward her and remembered exactly what she was, what she always had been. Prey. Flash! Lubin barked. Almost too late, she remembered to shut her eyes. Four pops sounded in rapid succession. A constellation of dim red suns ignited briefly through her eyelids. Go! She looked. The composite organism had shattered, just like that. Solitary predators wheeled on all sides, blinded and confused. Briefly blind, she remembered. Briefly confused. She had seconds to act and nothing to lose. She charged. 3 meters from the nearest beast, she started shooting. She squeezed off 5 rounds, 2 hits in the creature's flank. It snapped and dropped. 2 others stumbled into each other, a mere arm's length away. 1 shot each, and she was spinning in search of new targets. Somewhere offside, needle fire slammed obliquely across the ground. She ignored it and kept shooting. Something dark and massive hurtled past, bleeding flame. She nailed it in the flank for good measure, and suddenly she was transformed yet again, all that adrenalized midbrain circuitry flipping from flight to fight. Whimpering paralysis burned away in a fury of bloodlust and adrenaline. She shot a leg. She shot a great heaving rib cage, black and sleek as a dive skin. She shot a monstrous, silently snarling face, and realized it had been looking back. A part of her she hadn't even known was keeping score served up a number. 7. That's the number you can take before they come for you. She broke and ran. Lubin was running too. Poor blind Lubin. Lubin, the human tank. He'd switched back to clusterfuck and cleared a fiery path down 12 o'clock. He charged down the driveway. I told him no obstructions. Oh boy, will he be pissed if he trips on a sewer grating. Like a sighted man. Dogs shook their heads in his wake and wheeled, intent on reacquisition. They were closing on Clarke, too. Their paws drummed at her heels like heavy rain on a cloth roof. She was back on the asphalt, a few meters off Lubin's stern. 7 o'clock! She cried, diving. Incandescent sleet streaked centimeters overhead. Gravel and coarse pavement flayed the skin of her palms, bruised her arm and shoulder through nested layers of denim and copolymer. Flesh and fur burst into flame close enough to warm her face. She twisted onto her back. 3 o'clock! Flash wore off! Lubin turned and sprayed fire across the bearing. 3 other dogs were closing from 11. Still on her back, Clarke held the gun two-handed over her head and took them out with 3 meters to spare. Flash! Lubin shouted again. Clarke rolled and ducked, closing her eyes. 3 more pops, 3 more orange, fleshy sunrises. They backlit the memory of that last sighted instant, the instant when Lubin called out and every dog had flinched and turned their heads away. Smart, smart doggies, giggled some hysterical little girl in her head. They heard flash and they remembered it from the first time, and they closed their eyes. She opened hers, terrified of what she was about to see. The trick hadn't worked twice. Lubin was bringing up his weapon, desperately switching modes as some black slavering nemesis launched itself at his throat. Could be slavering. I can't remember what that word sounds like when actually read aloud. Slaver. There were no stars in its eyes. There were no stars in its eyes. Lubin fired, blind and point blank. Blood and bone exploded from the back of the creature's skull, but the carcass just kept going, 100 kilograms of gory, unstoppable momentum hitting him full in the chest. Lubin went over like a paper doll, gripping his dead attacker as though he could prevail over mass times acceleration through sheer bloody-minded determination. He couldn't, of course. He couldn't prevail over anything. He had only killed one of them. He disappeared beneath a dozen others. Suddenly, Clarke was charging forward, firing and firing and firing. There were screams, but none of them came from anything she might have hit. Something hot and hard slammed into her from the side. Something cold and harder slammed against her back. A monster grinned down at her, open-mouthed, drooling. Its forearms pinned her to the ground like piled cinder blocks. Its breath reeked of meat and petroleum. She remembered something that Ken had said. "You may get off easily. I rather suspect they'll be focusing on me." She really should have asked him about that back when she'd had the chance. Only now it was too late. "They're saving me," she thought distantly. "For dessert." From somewhere nearby, the sound of crunching bones. Jesus God, Ken, what did you think would happen? The weight on her chest was gone. On all sides she could hear the sound of monsters breathing. "You thought we had a hope in hell? You were blind, and I might as well have been. Were you trying to die, Ken? Did you just think you were in, did you just think you were indestructible?" I could understand that, maybe. I almost believed it myself for a while. Strangely, nothing had torn out her throat. I wonder what's keeping them, she thought. She opened her eyes. Xira loomed into the sky over her head, as though she were staring up from the grave at some colossal tombstone. She sat up in a circle maybe 4 meters across. Massed black bodies circumscribed its edge. They watched her, panting with past exertion, sitting calmly on their haunches. Clarke struggled to her feet. Her head itched with the memory of that irritating, inaudible tickle, freshly resurgent against her inner ear. She'd felt it when the monsters had first charged. She'd felt it again, just now. Ultrasonics, she realized. The heckler and cock lay at her feet. She bent to scoop it up. Dark shapes tensed on all sides. Jaws snapped, restive. But they didn't stop her. The Sikorsky Belle lay broken-backed 50 meters to her left, fat thorax and slender abdomen rising in a lopsided V from their common juncture. A ragged, charred hole gaped darkly in the cabin wall, as though some white-hot parasite had burst forth from inside. She took one shaky step in that direction. The dogs bristled and held their ground. She stopped, turned to face the black tower. The pack parted before her. They moved as she did, yielding in some approved direction, closing behind in her wake. After a few steps, her own shifting bubble of space fused with another. 2 pockets merged into a single oblong vacuole 10 meters down the major axis. 2 great torn carcasses lay piled before her in a pool of blood and spilled intestine. A foot protruded, unmoving, from beneath the nearest. Something else, dark, slick, strangely lobate? It must be oblate. twitched farther along one bloody flank as Clarke approached. It looked like some grotesque swollen parasite, pulsing weakly, spilled from the guts of its disemboweled host. It clenched. Suddenly, the image clicked. A blood-soaked fist, knotted in gory, matted fur. Ken! She reached down, touched the bloody hand. It pulled back as if scalded, disappeared beneath the carcass, leaving only the vague sense of some half-glimpsed deformity. The mass of carrion shifted slightly. Lubin hadn't torn these two animals apart. He'd merely blown lethal holes in them. Their evisceration had happened after the fact, a demon horde ripping through their fallen comrades in pragmatic, remorseless pursuit of their target. Lubin had used these two as a shield. Ken, it's me! She grabbed handfuls of fur and pulled. The blood-slicked pelage. Pelage? Pelage? Pelage. I don't think I've ever heard that word pronounced, ever. My apologies. I'm not perfect. I'm well read, but am I that well read? Pelage. Pelage? Let's go with pelage. I doubt we're going to see it again. Resisted her grip. Splinters of bone. Let's just take the paragraph from the top. I've lost momentum here. Ken, it's me. She grabbed handfuls of fur and pulled. The blood-slicked pelage resisted her grip. Splinters of bone stabbed her hands through clots of muscle and fur. On the third try, the center of mass tipped past some crucial threshold. The carcass rolled off Lubin like a great log. He fired, blind. Lethal shards sprayed into the sky. Clarke dropped to the ground. It's me, you idiot! And stared panic-stricken around the perimeter, terrified that Lubin had jump-started a whole new assault. But the pack only flinched and fell back a few steps, silent as ever. Clarke? He didn't even look human. Every square centimeter glistened with black gore. Even his eyes were pitted balls of dark meat. The pistol shook in his hand. It's me, she repeated. She had no idea how much of the blood was his. Are you... dogs? His breath hissed fast and panicky through clenched teeth. His breath hissed fast and panicky through clenched teeth, the breath of a terrified little boy. She looked at her escort. They looked back. Holding back for now. Someone called them off. His hand steadied. His breathing slowed. Discipline reimposed itself from the top down. The old familiar Lubin rebooting himself through sheer force of will. Told you, he coughed. Are you functional? He got slowly to his feet, tensing and grimacing a half-dozen times. Barely. His right thigh had been gored. A gash split the side of his face, from beneath his jaw up into the hairline. It tore straight through the shattered socket of his right eye. Clarke gasped. Jesus, your eye! He reached up to touch his face. It wasn't doing me much good anyway. The deformity of his hand, barely glimpsed before, was obvious now. 2 of the fingers were gone. And your hand, can it... He flexed the remaining digits. Fresh membranous scabs tore open at the stumps. Dark fluids seeped forth. Not as bad as it looks, he said hoarsely. You'll bleed out, you'll... He shook his head, staggered slightly. Enhanced clotting factors. Standard issue. I'm good to go. The hell you are. But dogs crowded close on one side, fell back on the other. Staying put obviously wasn't an option either. Okay then. She took him by the elbow. This way. We're not deviating. It wasn't a question. No, we don't have much choice. He coughed again. Clotting fluid bubbled at the corner of his mouth. They're hurting us. A great dark muzzle pushed her gently from behind. Think of it as an honor guard, she said. A row of glass doors beneath a concrete awning. The official logo of the Entropy Patrol set into stone overhead. The dogs formed a semicircle around the entrance, pushing them forward. What do you see? Lubin asked. Same outer doors. Vestibule behind, 3 meters deep. There's there's a door in the center of the barrier. Just an outline, no knob or keypad or anything. She could have sworn that hadn't been there before. Lubin spat blood. Let's go. She tried one of the doors. It swung open. They stepped across the threshold. We're in the vestibule. Dogs. Still outside. The pack was lined up against the glass now, staring in. I guess they're not... Oh, the inner door just opened. In or out? Inward. Dark inside. Can't see anything. She stepped forward. Her eye caps would adjust to that deeper darkness once they were in it. If they got in it. Lubin had frozen at her side, the remaining fingers on his mauled hand clenched into an impoverished fist. The grenade pistol, extended from his other hand, unwavering, pointing straight ahead. His ravaged face held an expression Clarke had never seen before, some smoldering picture of rage and humiliation that bordered on outright humanity. Ken, doors open. The thumb wheel clicked onto shipworm. It's open, Ken. We can walk right in. She touched his forearm, tried to bring it down, but his whole body was gripped in a sudden, furious tetanus. We don't have to... I told you before, he growled. More sensible to go around. His gun arm swung to 3 o'clock, pointing straight at the vestibule wall. His useless eye stared straight ahead. Ken... Oh, geez, one sorry. Oh, geez, I hope you didn't hear that. I'm sorry. Something got my nose. Ken, she turned, half expecting the monsters at their backs to crash through the panes and rip his arms off. But the dogs stayed where they were, seemingly content to let the drama play out without further intervention. He wants us to go forward, Lubin said. Always sets it up, always takes the initiative. All we ever do is fucking react. And blowing out a wall when the door's standing open? That's not a reaction? Lubin shook his head. It's an escape route. Ken... No good. The shipworm plunged into the side wall, spinning fast enough to shatter an event horizon. The wall erupted like a tabletop Vesuvius. Filthy gray cumulus billowed out and engulfed them in an instant. Stinging particles sandblasted Clarke's face. She closed her eyes, choked on the sudden sandstorm. From somewhere deep in the maelstrom, she heard the tinkle of shattering glass. Something grabbed her wrist and yanked her sideways. She opened her eyes into the swirling, soupy aftermath of the blast. Lubin drew her toward the ruptured wall. His ravaged face loomed close. This way. Get us in. She steered. He lurched at her side. The air was filled with the hiss of fine, sifting debris. The building sighed at its own desecration. An empty, twisted doorframe leaned crazily out of the murk. Pebbles of crumbled safety glass crunched beneath their feet like a diamond snowfall. There was no sign of the dogs, not that she'd be able to see them anyway, unless they were on her. Maybe the explosion had scared them back. Maybe they'd been trained to stay outside no matter what. Or maybe, any second now, they'd find this broken doorway and pour through to finish the job. A ragged hole resolved in the wall before them. Water ran from somewhere beyond. A ridge of torn concrete and rebar rose maybe 5 centimeters from the floor, the lip of a precipice. On the other side there was no floor, just a ruptured shaft extending into darkness both above and below. Twisted veins of metal and plastic hung from precarious holdfasts, or lay wedged across the shaft at unforeseen angles. A stream of water plummeted through empty space, spilling from some ruptured pipe above, splattering against some unseen grate below. The wall across the gap, a meter further in, had been breached. There was darkness beyond. "Watch this step," she said. They emerged into a dark, high-ceilinged space that was obviously part of the main reception area. Lubin turned and aimed back at the hole through which they'd come. Nothing jumped out at them. Nothing followed. "Lobby," Clarke reported. "Dark. Reception pedestals and kiosks over to the left. Nobody here." "Dogs?" "Not yet." Lubin's working fingers played along the edge of the breach. "What's this?" She leaned closer. In the boosted half-light, something glimmered from the torn cross-section like a thin vein of precious ore. Frayed bits protruded here and there from the shattered substrate. "Mesh of some kind," she told him. "Metallic, very fine weave, like thick cloth." He nodded grimly. "Faraday cage." "What?" "Shielding from the effects of the pulse." Like a handclap from God, the lights went on. Empath. Instantly, Clarke was snowblind. She brought up the H&K, waved it wildly in no particular direction. "The lights—" "I know." From somewhere deep in the building, the sudden hum of reawakened machinery.
"Jesus, priest-poking Christ," said an omnipresent voice. "You always have to make things so damn difficult. The door was open, you know."
"Achilles?" Her eye caps were adjusting. Objects and architecture resolved from the whitewash. But the fog wasn't entirely in her caps. Dust from the explosion hung in the air, bleeding contrast from their surroundings. Scree fanned out across the floor from their makeshift entrance. Polished stone paneling on the opposite wall, a good 10 meters from the breach, had cracked and fallen in a jagged heap.
"Or you could have just landed on the roof," the voice continued. "But no, you had to storm the battlements. Look at you now. Look at you now. You can barely stand."
Ventilators whirred in the distance, tugged wisps and streamers of suspended dust into grills in the ceiling. The air began to clear. Lubin swayed by the wall, favoring his injured leg. The lights had returned color to Clarke's sight. The gore on Lubin's body glistened shocking rust and crimson. He looked flayed alive. "We could really use some help here," Clarke said. A sigh from somewhere, from everywhere.
"Like the last time you came to town. Some things never change, eh?"
"This is your fault, you fucker. Your dogs.
Standard issue post-pulse security. And did I tell you to go up against them blind? Ken, what got into you? You're damn lucky I noticed in time."
"Look at him! Help him!" "Leave it," Lubin insisted, barely above a whisper. "I'm all right." The building heard him anyway.
"You're far from all right, Ken. But you're not exactly incapacitated either, and I'm not stupid enough to let down my guard. to someone who's just broken into my home by force. So let's work this out, and then maybe we can get you fixed up before you bleed to death. What are you doing here?"
Lubin started to speak, coughed, started again. I think you know already.
Assume I don't.
We had a deal. You were supposed to find out who was hunting us on the ridge. Clarke closed her eyes, remembering. The rest of the plan doesn't change.
In case it hasn't sunk in yet, I'm dealing with quite a few demands on my time these days,
The room pointed out.
but I assure you I have been working on it.
I think you've done more than that. I think you solved it, even before you lost so much of your resource base. We can tell you how to get that back, by the way, if that factors into your analysis.
Uh-huh. And you couldn't have just phoned me up from Podunk, Maine, or wherever you were?
We tried. Either you were busy dealing with all those other demands on your time, or the channels are down. The building hummed quietly for a moment, as if in thought. Deeper into the lobby, past dormant information pedestals and brochure dispensers and an abandoned reception counter, ruby LEDs twinkled from a row of security gates. The leftmost set turned green as Clarke watched.
Through there,
Desjardins said. She took Lubin's elbow. He limped at her side, maintaining a subtle distance, close enough to use her as a guide, far enough to spurn her as a crutch. An asymmetrical trail of dark, sticky footprints marked his passage. Each gatepost was a brushed aluminum cylinder half a meter across, extending from floor to ceiling like the bars of a cage. The only way in was between them. A black band the height of Clarke's forearm girdled each post at eye level, twinkling with color-coded constellations. But the whole band flushed red before they were halfway across the room.
"Oh, right," Desjardins remarked. "Security will cut you into little cubes if you try to sneak anything past."
A curved panel beneath the display slid back at their approach.
"Just throw everything in there."
Lubin felt out the chamber, set his pistol and belt down inside it. Clarke followed suit with her own weapon while Lubin struggled to remove his pack. He shrugged off Clarke's attempted assistance. The pack clanked on top of the pile. The panel slid shut. The wraparound display bloomed into a riot of images and acronyms. Clarke recognized some of them from Lubin's tutorial on the way up. Taser and microwave gun, mechanical spring lift, aerosol flypaper. Other things she'd never seen before. For all she knew, Lubin had brought them from his stash at the bottom of the Atlantic.
"Is that an electron stripper?"
Desjardins asked.
"And a pulse bomb? You brought your own tiny pulse bomb. Isn't that cute?" "You brought your own tiny pulse bomb. Isn't that cute?"
Lubin, his jaw set, said nothing.
"That's everything then? No nasty biosols or hidden freakwire? Because I'm telling you, those gates are very unforgiving. You walk through with any—"
Our implants,
Clarke said. "Those'll pass."
Lubin felt his way between the gateposts. No klaxons sounded, no lasers lanced down from overhead. Clarke stepped after him.
"The elevators are just around the corner."
Desjardins said. Completely disarmed, they stepped into Desjardins' parlor. Clarke led Lubin with soft words and an occasional touch. She didn't dare speak her mind, even in a whisper. But she gave his arm the slightest squeeze, and knew after all their long years together that he'd know what she meant. He didn't buy it for a second. Lubin replied with a blind glance and the twitch of a bloody lip. Of course he didn't. All according to plan, such as it was.
She had to take the physics on faith. She could buy everything else that Lubin had laid out on the way up. It didn't matter whether Desjardins believed their story, so long as he thought they might be useful. He wouldn't try to kill them outright until convinced otherwise. Which didn't mean that he wouldn't still try to disable them. He wasn't about to let anyone into his secret lair without taking precautions, disarming them, confining them, cutting their strings. Nothing lethal, Lubin had predicted, and nothing that will damage the structure. That limits his options. We can handle it. Fine, as far as it went. It was how they were going to handle it that she couldn't quite get behind. A good half-liter of water sloshed through the plumbing in Clarke's chest, unable to drain because of the tape on her electrolysis intake. 500 milliliters didn't sound like much. When she swam through the deeps, a steady current of seawater flowed through her implants, endlessly replenished. It hardly seemed possible that the stagnant dregs trapped there now would last more than a moment. 450 grams of molecular oxygen, Lubin had said. That's almost what you'd get in 2,000 liters of air. Her head couldn't argue with the numbers, but her gut was no mathematician. A rank of elevators stood before them. One set of doors was open. A soft light spilled from the compartment behind. He'll confine us first. They entered. The doors slid shut. The cage began to move. Down. This is insane, she thought. This can't work. But already she imagined she could hear the soft hiss of gas from hidden nozzles. She coughed and tripped her implants, praying to some indeterminate deity that Lubin hadn't fucked up his calculations. He hadn't. A familiar, subtle vibration started somewhere in her chest. Her guts writhed and flooded with their own private stock of isotonic saline. The liquid rose in her throat and filled her mouth. Brief nausea accompanied the flooding of her middle ears. A salty trickle ran down her chin before she remembered to clamp her lips together. The world, muted, all sounds suddenly faint and distant, except for the beating of her own heart. Just like that, she lost the urge to breathe. The descent continued. Lubin leaned against the wall of the elevator, his face a bloody cyclops mask. Clarke felt warm wetness on her upper lip. Her nose was running. She reached up and gave it a scratch, inconspicuously jamming the plug in her left nostril tight against the leak. Suddenly, her body thrummed deep inside, an almost subsonic quaking that vibrated her bones as though they were the parts of some great bass instrument. Faint nausea struck her in the throat. Her bowels quavered. The two most likely options, Lubin had mused, are gas and infrasound. She didn't know if gas was in Desjardins' arsenal. For all she knew, the air around them was already saturated. But this was obviously some kind of squawk box. The sound dish must stretch across the whole ceiling of the elevator, or maybe beneath the floor. The walls focused its vibrations, built resonances within the cage. The sound would be tuned to build intolerable harmonics in the lungs and middle ears, in the sinuses and trachea. It made her sick even with her airways and hard cavities flooded. She could scarcely imagine the impact on unbuttressed flesh. The implants didn't deal with gastrointestinal gases. Deep sea pressure collapsed those soft pockets down with no ill effect. And acoustic attacks were generally tuned to harder, more predictable airspaces anyway. Desjardins' squawk box was doing something down there, though. It was all she could do to keep from vomiting saline all over the compartment, from shitting in her dive skin. Any dryback would be on the floor by now, soiled and retching or unconscious. Clarke clenched at both ends and hung on. The elevator stopped. The lights went out. He knows, she thought. He figured it out. Of course he figured it out. How could we think he wouldn't? How could he not notice? Any second, the elevator would lurch back into motion, drag them up through this ruined, booby-trapped derelict where 65 floors of countermeasures would turn them into... Her head cleared. Her bones stopped tingling. Her bowels returned to the fold. Okay, guys. Desjardins' voice was tinny and distant in Clarke's flooded ears. End of the line. The doors slid open. An oasis of bright machinery on a vast, dark plain. That's what naked eyes would have seen. The Second Coming, perhaps. A Christ figure bathed in light and technology while all around was an infinite void. To Lennie Clarke, there was no darkness. The void was a converted parking garage, an empty gray cavern stretching half a city block on a side. Evenly spaced rows of support pylons held the ceiling from the floor. Plumbing and fiber op emerged from the walls, crawled along their surfaces like a webbing of sparse vines. Cables converged into a loosely bound trunk, winding along the floor to a horseshoe of workstations lit by chemical light strips. Christ was someone Lennie Clarke had met before. She'd first encountered him in darkness much deeper than this, a prisoner of Ken Lubin. Back then, Achilles Desjardins had been a man convinced he was about to die. It had been so much easier to read him then. Clotting blood cracked around Lubin's lips. His chest rose. Clarke shut down her own implants, yanking the plugs from her nose before the tide had fully receded within her. In the center of the room, in the heart of his high-tech horseshoe, Desjardins watched them approach. I thought I could make up for it, he said. In some strange, twisted way, it was actually good to see him again. For being a monster, he explained, as if someone had asked. Why I joined the patrol, you know? I couldn't change what I was, but I thought, if I helped save the world, maybe that could make up for it somehow. His mouth spread in a rueful smile. Pretty stupid, right? Look where it got me. Look where it got everyone, Lubin said. Desjardins' smile vanished. There was no shielding on his eyes, and yet somehow he was suddenly as opaque as any rifter. Please, Clarke thought, let this all be some monstrous, stupid mistake. Tell us we've misread everything. Please, prove us wrong. I know why you're here, he said, looking at Lubin. You let us in anyway. Well, I'd hoped to be at a bit more of an advantage by now, but whatever. Nice trick with the implants, by the way. I didn't even realize they'd work without your dive skin sealed up. Pretty stupid mistake for Achilles, the master pattern bleh. Let us take that sentence from the top. Pretty stupid mistake for Achilles, the master pattern matcher, eh? He shrugged. I've had a lot on my mind lately. You let us in, Lubin repeated, still advancing. Desjardins nodded. Yeah, that's far enough, by the way. They were 4 meters from his fort. Lubin stopped. Clarke followed suit. You want us to kill you? She asked. Is that it? Suicide by rifter, huh? He snorted a soft laugh. There'd be a certain poetry to that, I guess. But no. What then? He cocked his head. The gesture made him look about 8 years old. You were the ones who pulled that kin selection trick with my Lennies, weren't you? Clarke nodded, swallowing on the realization. So he's behind those, too. He's guilty after all. I figured, Desjardins admitted. It's the kind of thing that would only occur to someone who knew where they came from. Not many of those left up here. And the thing of it is, it's easy enough to do, but it's not so simple to undo. He looked hopefully at Lubin. But you said you knew how to... Lubin bared his teeth in a bloody rictus. I lied. Yeah, I kind of figured that too. Desjardins shrugged. So I guess there's only one thing left to talk about, isn't there? Clarke shook her head. What do you... Lubin tensed beside her. Desjardins' eyes flickered to the side for the merest instant. Cued, the surface of a nearby wall sparkled and brightened before them. The image that resolved on the smart paint was hazy but instantly recognizable. A sonar composite. It's Atlantis, Clarke said, suddenly uncertain. I see it, Lubin said. Not real time, of course, the lawbreaker explained. The baud rate's a fucking trickle, and with all the range and cover issues, I can only sneak in and grab a shot like this once in a while. But you get the idea. Lubin stood motionless. You're lying. Word of advice, Ken. You know how some of your people just kind of go off the deep end and wander into the black? You really shouldn't let them take squids when they go. You never know where their security transponders might end up. No. Clarke shook her head. You? It was you down there? Not Grace, not Seeger, not the corpses or the rifters or the M&Ms or even two lousy guys on a boat. You. All along. I can't take all the credit, Desjardins admitted. Alice helped me tweak Behemoth. Reluctantly, I'd guess, Lubin said. Oh, Achilles. One chance to fix the mess I made and you fucked it up. One chance to make peace and you threaten everyone I ever knew. One lousy, faint hope and you... How dare you? How dare you? A thin, final straw vanished in her hand. She stepped forward. Lubin reached out with one mutilated hand and held her back. Desjardins ignored her. I'm not an idiot, Ken. You're not the main attack force. You're just all you could scrape together on short notice. But you're not an idiot either, so there are reinforcements on the way. He held up his hand to preempt any protest. That's okay, Ken, really. I knew it was going to happen sooner or later, and I took all the necessary precautions. Although, thanks to you, I do seem to have lost a certain finesse when it comes to my big guns. His eyes jiggled slightly in their sockets. His fingers twitched. Clarke remembered Ricketts sweet-talking his way into Facina with a wink and a glance. The image on the wall dissolved. Numbers appeared in its place. Now I am in real-time contact with these guys. Can you see them, Ken? Channel 6? Lubin nodded. Then you know what they are. Clarke knew, too. 4 sets of lats and longs. Depth readings, zeroed. Targeting ranges. A row of little flashing icons that said, holding. I don't want to do this, Desjardins said. It was going to be my retirement home, after all. I never wanted to blow it up, just hobble parts of it. Smooth the transition, so to speak. But if I'm going to be dead anyway... She twisted in Lubin's grip. But even mutilated, Lubin was immovable. His hand shackled her arm like a granite claw, oily with coagulating fluids. She could only slip in his grasp. She could not break free. I do have other options, the lawbreaker continued. Contingency villas, you might say. I can go to one of those instead. He lifted a hand to the telemetry. You've got a lot more riding on this than me. He planned it for years, she realized, even when we thought he was helping us. And ever since we've been cowering in the dark like good little rabbits while our lines went dark and our contacts dried up, and it was him all along, cutting us off, fumigating the place so there wouldn't be any uncooperative tenants around when his luck ran out and he needed a place to hide. You asshole, she whispered, straining. He didn't look at her. So when are the cavalry coming, Ken? How did you call them in? How much did they know?
I tell you, Lubin said, and you call off the attack.
No, Ken. No, Ken. You call off your attack. Use whatever clever code words you set in place to shut down your sub's autopilot or to convince Helsinki that you were mistaken, or whatever it takes.
And you'll blow up Atlantis anyway.
What for? I have other options, as I said. Why waste all those perfectly good hostages for no payoff? They're worth way more to me alive.
For now.
Now is all we've got, buddy.
Clarke glared. From the man who had tried to kill her to the man who'd risked his life to stop him.
Every hour you're in this place, you kill more people than ever lived in Atlantis, she thought. Every hour I kill more people by leaving you here.
And Ken Lubin was about to cut a deal. She could see it in his stance, in that ruined, blind face that had been at her side and behind her back all these years. He wasn't entirely inscrutable. Not to her. Not even now.
I know you, Ken, Desjardins was saying. We go way back, you and I. We're soulmates. We make our own rules, and by God, we live by them. People don't matter. Populations don't matter. What matters is the rules. Am I right, Ken? What matters is the mission. If you don't deal, the mission fails. Ken, she whispered, but you can save them. The lawbreaker continued. Isn't that why you came back in the first place? Just give me your stats and the mission succeeds. You walk away, I abort the strike, and before I disappear, I'll even send you a fix for that nasty new strain of behemoth your buddies have been wrestling with. I gather by now a fair number of them are seriously under the weather back there.
She remembered a floating machine that had used his voice.
If killing 10 saves 1,000, it's a deal.
She remembered Patricia Rowan, torn apart on the inside, the face she presented to the world cold and unflinching. I tried to serve the greater good.
Or, Desjardins said, you can try and take me out and kill everyone you came up here to save.
His eyes were locked on Lubin's. It was as though the two of them shared their own pocket universe, as though Clarke didn't even exist.
Your choice. But you really shouldn't take too long making up your mind. Your tweaks are fucking things up all over the place. I don't even know how long I can keep control of these circuits.
She thought of what Patricia Rowan would have done, faced with this choice. She thought of the millions dead who would not have died, if only she had. She remembered Ken Lubin himself, 1,000,000 years ago. Is there anything you wouldn't do for the chance to take it back?
No, she said softly.
Desjardins raised an eyebrow, and, finally, deigned to look at her.
I wasn't talking to you. But if I were Lenie Clarke, he smiled, I wouldn't be shameless enough to pretend I gave a flying fuck about the rest of the world.
She twisted in Lubin's grasp and kicked as hard as she could. Her boot plunged deep into the gash in his thigh. Lubin staggered and cried out. And Clarke was free and springing forward. She launched herself directly at Desjardins. He won't risk it, she told herself. It's his only leverage. He's dead if he hits the button. He must know he's... Desjardins' eyes flickered left. His fingers twitched, and a tiny thread of doubt blossomed into full-blown horror as the numbers on the wall began to move. Holding transmuted into a whole new word, again and again and again along the bottom of the board. Clarke tried desperately not to read it, drove forward on the wings of some frantic infantile hope. Maybe if I don't see it, it won't happen. Maybe there's still time. But she did see it. She couldn't help seeing it, spelled out in quadruplicate full stop before the whole board went dark. Commit. With the next step, she toppled.
Something hummed deep in her head. Her bones sang with subtle electricity. Her legs collapsed beneath her. Her arms were dead weights at her sides. Her skull cracked painfully against the back of a workstation, cracked again against the floor. Her lung deflated with a tired sigh. She tried to hold her breath, but suddenly she was slack-jawed and drooling. Her bladder voided. Implants clicked and stuttered in her chest. "You gotta love the symmetry," a voice remarked from somewhere on the other side of the universe. "The ultimate victim, you know? The ultimate victim and the most powerful woman in the world all rolled into one tight little bod. And well, I'm the last word in one or two things myself." She couldn't feel a heartbeat. Darkness roared up from somewhere deep in her skull, swept swirling across her eyes. "It's fucking mythic is what it is," the voice continued, distant and barely audible. "We just had to get together." She didn't know what he was talking about. She didn't care. There was nothing in her world but noise and chaos, nothing in her head but commit, 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 commit. "They don't even know they're dead," she thought. "The torpedoes haven't reached Atlantis yet. They're living the last few minutes of their lives and they don't even know it. They'll live longer than me." A hand around her ankle, friction against the floor. "Bye, Jelaine. Bye, Avril. Bye, Dale and Abra and Hanuk." A great gulping wheeze, very close. The sensation of distant flesh expanding. "Bye, Kevin. Bye, Grace. Sorry we could never work it out." A pulse. She had a pulse. "Bye, Jerry. Bye, Pat. Bye again." There were voices. There was light somewhere, everywhere. "Bye, Alex. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. Alex. Bye, world." But that voice had come from outside her head. She opened her eyes. "You know I'm serious," Desjardins was saying. Somehow Ken Lubin was still on his feet, listing to port. He stood just beyond the pool of light. Achilles Desjardins stood within it. They confronted each other from opposite sides of a waist-high workstation. Lubin must have pulled her out of the neuroinduction field. He'd saved her life again. Not bad for a blind psychopath. Now he stood staring sightlessly into the face of his enemy, his hand extended, probably feeling out the edge of the field. "Dedicated little bitch, I have to admit," Desjardins said. "Willing to sacrifice a handful of people she actually knows for a planet full of people she doesn't. I thought she was way too human to be so rational." He shook his head. "But the whole point is kinda lost if the world blows up anyway, no? I mean, all those runaways on the ridge are about to die who've just died. And for what? The only thing that'll give their deaths any meaning at all is if you turn around and walk away." "They're gone," Clarke thought. "I killed them all."
"You know how many battleites are still wobbling around up there, Ken, and you know I'm good enough to have got into at least a few of them. Not to mention all the repositories of chemical and biological weapons kicking around groundside after 100 years of R&D. All those tripwires run right through my left ventricle, buddy. Lenie should thank the spirit of motherfucking entropy that she didn't kill me, or the heavens would be raining fire and brimstone by now."
Clarke tried to move. Her muscles buzzed, hung over. She could barely lift her arm. Not the usual Medcubby field by a long shot. This one had been cranked up to quell riots. This one was industrial. Still, Lubin didn't speak. He managed a controlled stagger to the left, his left arm extended. His arm still extended, sorry.
"Channels 7 through 19, Desjardins told him. Look for yourself. See the kill switches? See where they lead? I've had 5 years to set this up, Ken. You kill me, you kill billions.
I expect you'll find a number of those tripwires are no longer connected.
Lubin's voice was thin and strained. What, you're pack hunting Lennies? They can't get into the lines until the lines open. And even then, so what? They're her, Ken. They're concentrated essence of Lenie Clarke at the absolute peak of her game. They get their teeth into a tripwire? You think for a second they won't pull it themselves? Lubin cocked his head slightly, as if taking note of some interesting sound. It's still a good deal, Ken. Take it. You'd have a hard time killing me anyway. I mean, I know what a tough hombre you are, but your motor nerves short out just the same as anyone else's. And not to put too fine a point on it, but you're blind.
Realization stabbed Clarke like an icicle.
Achilles, you idiot. Don't you know what you're doing? Haven't you read his file?
Lubin was speaking. So why deal in the first place?
Because you are a tough hombre. You could probably hunt me down by smell if it came to that, and even though you're having a really off day, I'd just as soon not take the chance.
You're talking to Ken Lubin,
She raged silently, trapped in her own dead flesh.
Do you actually think you're threatening him?
So we disappear. We disappear, you disappear, the world relaxes. Lubin wavered in and out of focus. Until someone else kills you. Clarke tried to speak. All she could force out was a moan, barely audible even to herself.
It's not a threat at all.
You disappear, Desjardins said. Lennie's mine. Saved her special.
It's an inducement.
You're proceeding from a false premise, Lubin pointed out.
Yeah? What premise is that?
That I give a shit. Clarke caught a glimpse of muscles bunching in Lubin's left leg, of a sudden sodden pulse of fresh blood coursing down his right. Suddenly he was airborne, hurtling through the field and overtop the barrier from an impossible standing start. He rammed into Desjardins like an avalanche, pure inertia. They toppled out of sight behind the console, to the sound of bodies and plastic in collision. A moment's silence. She lay there, tingling and paralyzed, and wondered who to root for. If Lubin's momentum hadn't carried him completely through the field, he'd be dying now, with no one to pull him to safety. Even if he'd made it across, he'd still be helpless for a while. Desjardins might have a chance, if the collision hadn't stunned him.
Achilles, you murderer, you psychopath, you genocidal maniac, you foul, vicious monster. You're worse than I am. There's no hell deep enough for you. Get out of there, please, before he kills you.
Something gurgled. Clarke heard a faint scratching of fingernails on plastic or metal. A meaty thud, like someone slinging a dead fish against the deck. Or the flopping of a limb, stunned in transit, struggling back to life. A brief scuffling sound.
Ken, don't do it.
She gathered all her strength into a single, desperate cry. No! It came out, barely whispered. On the far side of the barricade, a wet, snapping pop. Then, nothing at all.
Oh God, Ken, don't you know what you've done? Of course you know. You've always known. We could have saved it. We could have made things right, but they were right about you. Pat was right. Alex was right. You monster. You monster. You wasted it all. God damn you.
She stared up at the ceiling, tears leaking around her eye caps, and waited for the world to end. She could almost move again, if only she could think of a reason to. She rolled onto her side. He sat cross-legged on the floor beside her, his bloody face impenetrable. He looked like some carved and primitive idol, awash in human sacrifice.
How long? She rasped. Long? Or has it started already? Are the claves on fire? Are the bombs falling? Is it enough for you? Are you fucking hard yet?
Oh, that. Lubin shrugged. He was bluffing.
What?
She struggled up on her elbow. No, of course I'm getting a phone call. Give me a sec. Sorry about that. That was an important call. I wouldn't have taken it if it weren't. Let me get the mic into position here. Sorry. Or has it started already? Are the claves on fire? Are the bombs falling? Is it enough for you? Are you fucking hard yet? Oh, that. Lubin shrugged. He was bluffing. What? She struggled up on her elbows. But the tripwires, the kill switches, he showed you. Props. You saw through them? No, they were quite convincing. Then how? It didn't make sense that he'd do it. Ken, he destroyed A sudden, impossible ray of hope. Unless that was a bluff too? No, Lubin said quietly. She sank back. Let me wake up from this, she prayed. He destroyed Atlantis because he had another deterrent to fall back on. Making good on the smaller threat increased the credibility of the larger one. The man without a conscience shrugged. But once you're dead, deterrence has already failed. There's no point in acting on a threat when it can't possibly achieve your goal. He could have, easily. I would have. You're vindictive. Desjardins wasn't. He was mainly interested in self-gratification. Lubin smiled faintly. That was unusually enlightened of him, actually. Most people are hardwired for revenge. Perhaps Spartacus freed him of that, too. But he could have done it. It wouldn't have been a credible threat otherwise. So how did you know? Doomsday machines are not easy things to assemble. It would have taken a great deal of time and effort for no actual payoff. Faking it was the logical alternative. That's not good enough, Ken. Try again. I also subjected him to Gansfeld interrogation once. It gave me certain insights into... She shook her head. He didn't speak for a while. Finally, we were both off the leash. I thought you gave yourself a new leash. I thought your rules... Still, I know how he felt. Lubin unfolded, carefully, and climbed slowly to his feet. Give me 1 sec. Sorry about that. I'm Mr. Popular today. Someone outside was like, "Hey, help me." I was like, "Give me like 10 minutes." And then they started explaining their problem anyway, and I'm like, "Okay." So I'll deal with that later. I don't even know where we were. I also subjected him to Gansfeld interrogation once. It gave me certain insights into. She shook her head. He didn't speak for a while. Finally, we were both off the leash. I thought you gave yourself a new leash. I thought your rules. Still, I know how he felt. Lubin unfolded, carefully, and climbed slowly to his feet. Did you know what he'd do? She couldn't hide the pleading in her voice. He seemed to look down at her. Lenie, I've never known anything my entire life. All I can ever do is go with the odds. It wasn't what she wanted to hear. She wanted him to describe some telltale glitch in Desjardins' shadow show, some compelling bit of evidence that said, the worst will not happen. She wanted some channel of ostensible input traced back to an empty socket, impossibly disconnected from its fiber op. Anything but a gamble based on empathy between two men without conscience. She wondered if he was disappointed, even a little bit, that Desjardins had been faking it after all. She wondered if he'd really been expecting it. What are you so down about? Lubin asked, sensing what he couldn't see. We just saved the world. She shook her head. He was going to lose anyway. He knew that better than we did. Then we advanced the schedule significantly, at least. Saved millions of lives. How many millions? She wondered. And then, what difference does it make? Could saving 12 million today make up for killing 10 million in the past? Could the blood-soaked meltdown Madonna somehow transmute into Saint Lenny in the Black, savior of 2 million net? Was the algebra of guilt really so elementary? For Lenny Clarke, the question didn't even apply, because any millions saved today had only been spared from a fate she'd condemned them to in the first place. There was no way at all, that she would ever be able to balance those books. At least, she said, the debt won't get any bigger. That's a needlessly pessimistic outlook, Lubin observed. She looked up at him. How could you say that? Her voice was so soft she could barely hear herself. Everyone's dead. He shook his head. Almost everyone. The rest of us get another chance. Ken Lubin reached out his hand. The gesture was absurd to the point of farce. That this torn and broken monster, gored, bleeding, could pretend to be in any position to offer assistance to others. Lenie Clarke stared for a long moment before she found the strength to take it. Another chance, she reflected, pulling herself to her feet, even though we don't deserve one. Epilogue. Singular Hessian. Failure to converge. Confidence limits exceeded. Further predictions unreliable. And that was Behemoth Book 2, Seppuku, as well as the end of the Rifters trilogy. Here I'm going to continue with Peter Watts's acknowledgments and notes and references slash afterword, which will be a little bit longer. If you were only in it for the book, I suppose you'd probably tune out about now. If you want to hear what Peter Watts was reading, thinking about, and looking at, you can stick around for another couple minutes. I'm not going to read all the citations. I will, unless he's got something particular written. Yeah, he does have something particular written on a couple of them, which I'll try and read. There are a total of how many footnotes? 1, 2, 3, 51. 51 footnotes. I'm not going to read them all. I will read one or two that are relevant. Acknowledgements. The usual gang of suspects without whom I could never have pulled this off. David Hartwell, my editor, nailed some serious structural problems with the first draft and helped me fix them. Moshe Feder took point through the day-to-day grind from delivery to rewrite to kicking and screaming to rending of garments to racking hysterical sobs and finally to parturition. In what has become an annual rite, a motley collection of subversive literary and political malcontents, Laurie Channer, Cory Doctorow, Nalo Hopkinson, Becky Maines, John McDade, Janice O'Connor, Steve Semensky, Isaac Spindell, and Pat York, met clandestinely at an undisclosed location back during the summer of 2002. There, they tore apart the first 2 chapters of this puppy, among others, then helped to sew them back together again. This is the second time that a whole bunch of people have seen how my novel begins, while virtually no one sees the rest until it is too late to change anything. I suspect self-esteem issues may be involved. But the fact that hardly anybody read the whole thing doesn't mean that lots of people didn't contribute to it. David Nickel offered advice, insights, and endless mockery throughout the process. His input proved so valuable I can almost overlook the fact that I had to get up at 5:30 in the fucking morning and go running for 10 miles to avail myself of it. Laurie Channer withstood endless pissing and moaning over a story for which her input was frequently solicited, even though she was never actually allowed to read the damned thing. She still hasn't, as of this writing, which would be in like '05 or so. I owe many details of the helicopter crash scene to Glenn Norman and Glenn Morrison, both pilots, and both more helpful to pesky authors than I had any right to expect. I was astonished to learn that even when a helicopter loses all power in mid-flight, it's still possible to walk away from the crash by practicing an emergency technique called auto-rotation. Glenn Morrison, in fact, survived a crash eerily parallel to the one described herein, except for the fact that he is not blind and killer dogs were not involved.
For the record, he doesn't think that there's a hope in hell of pulling off that maneuver in real life if you are blind, and he knows his stuff. On the other hand, he doesn't know Ken Lubin. Parts of other people's life histories made their way into the story. Certain impressionistic details of the dog attack took their inspiration from wild canines encountered by one Rob Cunningham on his travels through India. You may know Rob as the dude who created those gorgeous spaceship designs for Homeworld and Homeworld 2, the RTS computer games from Relic Entertainment. 8-year-old Achilles Desjardins' experiments with aerobraking were lifted from the childhood confessions of Mark Schowell, fisheries biologist, although Mark is not a sexual sadist so far as I know. If anything, he's a masochist, judging by the guy he chose to do his MSc under. Which is yeah. Isaac Spindel, MD, PhD, skilled in so many and varied endeavors that it makes me sick, helped me load Taka's lines with plausible medical chrome. Dave, the bioinformatician, Block, answered numerous impertinent questions about artificial nucleotides and minimum genotype sizes. Unfortunately, one of the things he taught me was that you can't cram a 1.1 megabyte genotype into a cell 250 nanometers across, which contradicts physical stats for Behemoth already described in Maelstrom. Major David Buck of the New Zealand Defence Force helped me out on the subject of fuel-air explosive ordnance. Steve Ballantine, Hanu Blomila, Rick Kleffel, Harry Pulley, Catriona Sparks, B.B. Schroer, Janine Stinson, Mac Tonnies, and David Williams have all pointed me to relevant research papers, reviews, opinions, and/or news articles that went into the Behemoth mix one way or another. Jan Stinson also went through the manuscript with an editorial eagle eye, catching typos and bigger problems which I hope the rest of you won't notice. Not to mention others whom I've probably forgotten, and of whom I hereby preemptively beg forgiveness. You can't blame any of these good folks if this book sucks, since virtually none of them were allowed to read it. If it does suck, maybe that's why. You can't even blame David Hartwell, who did read it, because the book would have sucked even harder without his input. You can only blame me, and you might as well, since I've already got your money. Well, 50 cents of it, anyway. The wet popping sound. I loved listening to Desjardins dying, and it's really ignominious too. It's like Ken basically falls on the guy, and before he goes unconscious, manages to snap, crackle, pop. You know, overextend and cause a major fracturing of his spinal column. Notes and references. Once again, it's time to trot out a variety of citations that will hopefully serve as a valuable educational resource, even though they're primarily intended to cover my ass against nitpickers. If you have come late to this saga, you may not find the following references as complete as you'd like. Any real-world science elements introduced in Starfish and Maelstrom were cited at the end of those books. I don't repeat those citations here, even though many elements persist into Behemoth. I do, however, cite related research that has come out since Maelstrom was released. I'm so popular. This is important.
What do you know? It was good news for a change. Sorry.
Personal stuff. Nothing here nor there.
I do, however, cite related research that has come out since Maelstrom was released, especially if it makes me look especially prescient in some way. Incidentally, you can find all these if you take the link in the YouTube channel to the in the YouTube stream description, video description, whatever, to on the rifters.com website to the book itself. They should all be down there at the bottom of the book. Um, and it's got a list of all of them, and you can look more into them. So while I won't read out the overwhelming majority of the footnotes, you know where to find them. So if you're looking for my original sources on smart gels, fine tuning, or the Maelstrom ecosystems, you'll have to go back and check the other books. You still may not find everything you're looking for, but you might at least make my Amazon numbers look a little less dismal. Atlantis. There goes the neighborhood. There is a place in the middle of the North Atlantic where the currents stop dead. An eye in the middle of that great slow gyre revolving between Europe and North America. It seemed like a reasonable spot to hide from lethal particles potentially borne on wind and water, so I put Atlantis there. The surrounding topography took some inspiration from a 2003 report on abyssal mineralogy. Impossible Lake was inspired by the ultrasaline lens of heavy water described in the groundbreaking documentary series Blue Planet. The failure of the Labrador Current and the Gulf Stream seems plausible in view of increased meltwater discharge from the Arctic. And I know they don't actually figure into the plot anywhere, but Clarke worries about them on her way to the surface in the first chapter, so it's fair game. Giant squids now outmass the whole human race, and they're getting even bigger. Remember that when you decide to next take a swim in the briny deep. Aye. Behemoth. We continue to discover life increasingly deep in the lithosphere. At last count, deep crustal rocks beneath the Juan de Fuca Ridge, yes, the very ridge from which Behemoth escaped at the end of Starfish, have yielded evidence of heretofore unknown microbial life forms. Water samples from boreholes 300 meters below that seabed show depleted levels of sulfate. Something down there is alive, unclassified, and consuming sulfur. There's no evidence that it would destroy the world if it ever reached the surface, but then again, there's no evidence it wouldn't either. I can always hope. That hope is a faint one, though. Patricia Rowan was right to argue that Behemoth, by virtue of its ancient origins, should be an obligate anaerobe. To even make it out onto the seabed would require either a very convenient mutation or a deliberate tweak. Damn lucky the plot called for one anyway. Waters et al. Have recently reported the discovery of an ancient hot vent dwelling nanobe called Nanoarchaeum equitans. Genome size, proportion of junk DNA, and diameter are all in the Behemoth ballpark. Even better, it's a parasite/symbiont. It lives on a much larger archaeon called Ignicoccus. However, its minimalist genome, about 500 kilobases, half the size of Behemoth's, lacks the recipes for certain vital enzymes, which it must therefore get from its host. It could never be a free liver. Behemoth, with its larger genome, is more self-sufficient. But how it crams all those extra genes into a capsule only 60% of the size remains a mystery. The fishheads and the corpses got into a bit of a debate about the odds of Behemoth hitching a ride in the flesh of a dispersing larval fish. I was always worried about that myself, even back when I was writing Starfish. If true, there'd be no reason why Behemoth would not have, in fact, taken over the world billions of years ago.
Invertebrate larvae do seem to cross vast distances in the deep sea. Fortunately, they generally go into a sort of arrested development en route, making them unlikely carriers of Behemoth, which needs an actively metabolizing host to withstand long-term thermoosmotic stress. It also appears that even highly dispersing larval fish species maintain fairly distinct geographic ranges, judging by the lack of genetic flow between populations around adjacent islands. Worst comes to worst, local topographic and chemical conditions can constrain the distribution of various deep water species. So, I dodged a bullet. This was not prescience on my part, and it may yet come back and bite me in the ass. At least one adult fish may have swum through deep water from Patagonia all the way up to Greenland. Seppuku. Artificial microbes are almost mainstream these days. J. Craig Venter, the human genome guy, has completed an entirely artificial genome even as I type, hoping that such organisms will be able to cure the world's environmental ills. Peter Schultz and his team have already tweaked E. coli to synthesize a novel amino acid not found in nature, hoping it will be able to outcompete the baseline strain. Entirely synthetic organisms, built from interchangeable genetic modules, are just around the corner. I wish all these guys better luck than Jakob Holtzbrink's gel jocks had when they tweaked Behemoth. Seppuku's genetic template was first synthesized by Leslie Orgel back in 2000. TNA actually does duplex with conventional nucleic acids. The idea of alien genes incorporating themselves into our own nuclear material is even more old hat than artificial microbes. Not only are our genes rife with parasitic DNA from a range of bugs, but functional genes originally brought into the cell by the ancestors of our own mitochondria appear to have migrated into the nucleus. Massive horizontal gene transfer between species has occurred throughout much of Earth's history. And of course, the symbiotic incorporation of small cells into larger ones has a long and honorable history reflected in every eukaryotic cell on the planet. Back in Maelstrom, I cited chloroplasts and mitochondria. Apicoclasts are a related example, devolved endosymbionts found in toxoplasma and plasmodium. Taka Willette's odd appreciation of proline as a metabolic catalyst will probably be a little behind the times by mid-century, since Movasaki and Jacobson have already pointed out the potential of such simple molecules to act as enzymes. The chemistry of character. Some readers may wonder if I have trouble distinguishing between personality and neurochemistry. It's a fair point, but don't blame me. Blame the scientists who can't let a week go by without reporting yet more evidence that personality is just another word for biochemistry, albeit written in an exceedingly complex font. E.g., Hanuk Jaeger's propensity for violence, rooted in his monoamine oxidase levels. Unless you're one of those Easter Bunny vitalists who believes that personality results from some unquantifiable divine spark, there's really no alternative to the mechanistic view of human nature. Which is a theme, of course, that will come up a bit in his later books, particularly Blind Sight and Echopraxia. He'll build on that. A central tenet of the whole Rifters saga, introduced in Starfish and expanded in Maelstrom and Behemoth, is that false memories of abuse can cause neurological changes in the individual every bit as real as genuine memories can. That was pretty speculative when Starfish first came out, but recent research has added empirical evidence of this effect. Details on the care and feeding of sociopaths were largely taken from the work of Robert Hare and others. Behemoth's musings regarding the adaptive value of sociopathy in corporate settings may not be entirely off the mark either, and there's 3 footnotes dedicated to that alone. And as these references should make clear, neither Ken Lubin nor Achilles Desjardins are sociopaths in the classic sense. More goes into such creatures than a mere absence of conscience. Maelstrom established that guilt trip took its lead largely from the genes of certain parasites which could alter the behavior of their hosts. The actual mechanism by which this occurred was not known when that book came out, although some had speculated that it occurred right down at the neurotransmitter level. I hung Guilt Trip's hat on that hypothesis, and am now relieved to report that the gamble paid off. At least one such parasitic puppet master works by screwing with its host's serotonin-producing neurons. This one might be worth reading. Heli S. and Thomas F., 2003. Effects of Microphallus papillorobustus, platyhelminthes trematoda, on serotonergic immunoreactivity and neuronal architecture in the brain of Gammarus insensibilis, crustacea, amphipoda, proceeding of the Royal Society of London. So say all that 5 times fast. I'm sorry if I mangled it. Goodbye. That's the last apology you'll hear from me. Ha! He said, lying. An accompanying commentary article gives a very nice summary of the so-called trolley paradox, not to mention an airtight rationale for pushing people in front of trains. Jovellanos' arguments may be simplistic. The prefrontal cortex, after all, seems to play at least some role in moral decision-making. 3 more footnotes here. But then again, Jovellanos was a bit of a zealot, for which she paid a price. Speaking of moral decision-making, Lennie Clarke's passion for revenge earlier in the Rifters saga, not to mention Ken Lubin's unacknowledged passion for same later on, are not merely overused dramatic tropes. We appear to be hardwired to punish those who have slighted us, even if, and this is the counterintuitive bit, even if our acts of vengeance hurt us more than those who have trespassed against us. I like to think the reason the world gets another chance at the end of this story is because, as Lubin speculates, Spartacus disabled the vengeance response in Achilles Desjardins at the same time it destroyed his conscience. He may have been a monster. He may have been a sexual sadist. But in that one retrofitted corner of his soul, he may have been more civilized than you or I will ever be.
See, he was a good guy all along.
You know. He wasn't. He really, really wasn't. Was not, emphatically. And finally, the most disturbing real-world echo of this imaginary hellhole comes from the Village Voice, reporting on ongoing research toward an anti-remorse pill, a drug developed to cure post-traumatic stress syndrome, which would soothe the torturer as well as the tortured. Such neurochemical tweaks would work by short-circuiting guilt itself, making it that much easier to get a good night's sleep after mowing down crowds of unruly civilians protesting unpopular government policies. Yes, I called my version absolution, but people, it was supposed to be ironic. Here, the maelstrom just moved outside. Some background ambiance from the world above the waterline. The developing world has no shortage of reasons to be pissed at the other two. By mid-century, I'm postulating a sort of Africa-wide schadenfreude in response to the collapse of Enem's societal infrastructure. The icing on that bitter cake is the further prediction that the majority of the African population will consist of women. I base this on the fact that in Ethiopia, at least, malnourished women are more likely to give birth to daughters than sons. Presumably, for the same energetics reasons this happens in other species. I'm basically suggesting that generations of disease, starvation, and exploitation/indifference will result in one righteously pissed, gender-skewed hotbed of discontent in which the myth of a victimized woman's apocalyptic vendetta would catch on real fast. Think of liberation theology, that violent incarnation of Catholicism that arose from the political turmoil of Latin America in the last century. Now, move it to Africa and emphasize a warrior Madonna at its heart. And don't say I didn't warn you. The various bits of weaponry portrayed in this novel, from Miri's arsenal to Desjardins' booby traps to South Africa's ICBMs, are taken from a variety of sources including the USAF, The Economist, Cornell University Peace Studies Program, and even the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts. Evidently, weapons-grade infrasound isn't all it's cracked up to be. On the other hand, it seems surprisingly simple to generate your own electromagnetic pulse. Electronic Wildlife and Digital Evolution. Maelstrom hung on the premise that the same Darwinian processes that shape life in this world are equally applicable to the digital realm, that self-replicating software will be literally alive when the conditions of natural selection are met. That position has gained recent ground. Terms like digital organism crop up in the most respectable scientific journals. And you can now download freeware apps that let you experiment with digital evolution on your desktop. E-life is proceeding on track. Maybe the Maelstrom ecosystems won't be far behind. Maelstrom extended the conceit of Internet as ecosystem to a consensus superorganism that exploited the myth of the meltdown Madonna as a reproductive strategy. 5 years further down the timeline, parts of that superorganism have transmuted, with a little help from their friends, into the shredders and Lenies of Behemoth. Ecologically, we've moved from a climax ecosystem to a weedy and impoverished landscape of virtual rats, gulls, and kudzu. And in keeping with that spirit, the virtual ecology aspects of this novel echo the pest species dynamics common in real-world ecosystems. A common response to outbreaks of unwanted insect species is to haul out the pesticides. The pest's usual response is to A. Develop resistance, and B. Crank up its reproductive rate to offset the increased mortality. Once this happens, human managers don't dare stop spraying because the pest has been pushed into a state of chronic outbreak. Its increased reproductive rate will result in a catastrophic population explosion the moment spraying ends. This is essentially what happened during the spruce budworm infestations of the North American Maritimes back in the 70s and 80s. And there is a footnote here with actual text worth reading. If you're looking for primary sources on this, though, you're SOL. I'm just regurgitating memories of a grad course I took in theoretical ecology back at the University of Guelph. I rather suspect that we may be in for a replay with the current bark beetle invasion. This would be current back in 2005 again. You don't need a PhD to see the parallels between this and the exorcist/shredder dynamic at play in EnemNet. Lenie Clarke never took Ecology 101. She made her moves for her own twisted and unrelated reasons. Ironically, though, it may have been the right course of action from a purely ecological standpoint. Pest species tend to peak and crash cyclically if you just leave them alone. Once you've cranked them into outbreak mode, perhaps the only way to restore any kind of natural balance is to just take your foot off the brake, grit your teeth, and take your lumps until the system stabilizes. Assuming it does. Predicting the past. Smart gels. Head cheeses. Those neuron puddings that the corpses used to jam the rifters in the first half of this book, and which played a much more central role in the previous ones. They exist now, in real life. Neurons, cultured from rat brains, now operating remote-controlled robots at a lab near you. Piss me right off. I thought I had years before this stuff caught up with me. And that's it. That's the whole shebang. That's the entire Rifters trilogy. I hope everybody dug it.
I sure did. It's a blast. It's fun going back and reading Watts's earlier work before Blindsight, which really got him a lot of notice internationally and otherwise. It's the first book of his that I read aloud. I had seen the Rifters trilogy in libraries and bookstores when they had first come out, but hadn't really paid them much heed. Someone recommended me Blindsight. I read it and was immediately hooked. And then read Rifters, and there's parts of Rifters I actually like better in terms of being a human story. They really do well there. We found out what killed Mandelbrot, sadly, which was those dogs. Those beefed up super security dogs. And yeah, and we're kind of left with the implication that, okay, so Achilles didn't end the world, Behemoth is still everywhere, but Seppuku is doing whatever it's doing, changing all biological life carbon-based life as we know it into something else, something we can't imagine at this point. Uh, so it's it's a pretty optimistic ending, really. It's like, yeah, things are awful, but the Earth abides, and humanity too abides. So, incidentally, if you've never read the book The Earth Abides, I recommend it. It's quite good. One of the earlier pieces of apocalypse fiction. Pretty sure that was its title, The Earth Abides. Let me double check. Don't knock over that, please. That would be bad. That would be water all over computer bits. I love a parade. The earth abides. There's no the. By George R. Stewart. It is Earth Abides from 1950s, I think. 1949. It's quite good. I recommend it. Even if you're not into apocalypse fiction. It's kind of worth reading. Kind of worth reading. It's archetypal. I'm not sure if it's the first example of a post-apocalyptic book in terms of where it's taking place, basically present day if human civilization ended overnight. In this case, due to a disease or super flu or something. I don't remember now. Pretty sure it was a disease. Basically everyone dies except for this like one dude who was like snake bit or something um, in a cabin in the mountains, and he goes into a small coma for like a week or two or something, and then wakes up from the coma and is like, shit, I need like provisions and stuff, and proceeds to find the world basically abandoned. Uh, like civilization is over. Not everybody's dead. There's still other people around, and so it kind of deals with building human communities back and whatnot. So it's archetypal. So if you have any interest in post-apocalyptic fiction, I recommend it. Um, I don't know how we got onto this tangent. Really not sure how we got onto this tangent about Earth Abides by George R. Stewart, but we did, and here we are. This happens a lot. Hmm. Anything else intelligent? Oh yeah, I guess going forward, current game plan or next immediate future is we're going to chip away at the short story collection by Greg Egan called Oceanic, which includes the short story by the same name, Oceanic, which kind of involves religious programming. If I remember correctly, it's been a hot minute since I read it, so I may be misremembering and thinking of another thing entirely. I may be confusing it. Oh, or is it the one where people go bumming across? It's like post-humanity, bumming across trying to find cool things, and they wind up finding like flatlanders or something in a planet. Flatlanders being two-dimensional people who are actually two-dimensional, a two-dimensional life. I don't remember now. We'll get there. It's the last story in the book, and it's beefy. It might take two streams. I don't know. We'll find out. Um, Yeah, and we already read the first story in it, which was called, drumroll please, Can I Reach It Without Taking Off the Headphones? Let's find out.
Yeah, yeah, we can. Wow, we're so good. Wow.
What was the first? Uh, was it Lost Continent? Yes, it was Lost Continent. So next week we will be going with the second story in it called Dark Integers, which my brain seems to remember as being a follow up to a short story in Luminous, possibly Luminous itself. Somehow adjacent, but I don't remember. Maybe not. So I've mentioned this before. I'm a Greg Egan fanboy. I understand not as much about what's ever going on in a Greg Egan book as I'd like, but I thoroughly enjoy reading him anyway. At any rate, oh yeah, each one of these short stories is basically going to be its own stream. Oh geez, because these are all long. These are all like 50 pages a pop. Um, except for Crystal Knights and Steve Fever. I can do those in one. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Probably. Yeah, I can do those in one. That's no problem. And I can probably do Induction and Singleton in one. They'll be longish. Yeah, okay. So eyeballing page numbers and guessing as to how long they'll all take. In the book we just read, page count, uh, the way the text was formatted, pages were pretty short to read through. There's a bit more text per page here. Let's see. Call that one, two, three. It's going to be at least seven installments. Geez, how long is Hot Rock? It's not too bad. Riding the Crocodile is long, long. Oceanic is a couple hundred pages. That's going to be two streams on its own. Oh, the difficulties of reading like a very dense series of shorts. Come on, where's the starting page? No, seriously, where's the starting page? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. 457. I went the wrong direction. Yeah, that one's not too bad. That one's like 60 something pages. Anyway, we're going to read us some Greg Egan next week. So there. Ha! If you don't like it, I'm sorry. I can't win every time, right? Think of it. Take the positive route, I guess. There's a line, uh, practically a catchphrase for this community-run radio station near where I used to live when I used to live in Connecticut, which I don't live near anymore. Out of Bridgeport, WPKN. Some songs I like, some songs I don't like. Which I think was delivered by a child who had said it at some point. Um, and kind of describing, what they felt about WPKN, the experience. I wonder if I think they're still around. I hope they are. So if you live in the New York tri-state area, check out WPKN, which was, oh geez, I don't remember, 87.9 on an FM dial. No, I know how to type. 89.5. There we go. And they are still around. So if you can pick them up on your FM dial at 89.5 WPKN, check them out. I am shilling a community-run broadcast radio station. They also broadcast online, so you can probably do that too. I'm shilling them because they are worth your time, or they were at least when I listened to them like 10 years ago, back before I moved out of range of their tower signal. Anyway, that's me. After we do Oceanic, which is going to take, again, that's going to be at least 7 streams. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, geez. Uh, so tentative guess at this stage is we will get Hyperion, or the Hyperion cantos, started around December 1st, either December 1st or 8th, assuming everything goes well and I don't have some crisis evolve in the meantime. Um, so for all the people excited for Dan Simmons' work, sci-fi opera or poetry meet, if you wish, it's an adventure. It's good. It's really good. Um, it's grim. It's beautiful. It's amazing. It's weird. It's gritty. It's a lot of things. It's so many different things. Uh, it'll be divided. It's divided into 2 books. The first book is basically a series of character background vignette portraits, which basically describe this is how this character. This is the seminal event that got this character to where they now are and are in the plot. Um, and then the second book is like the actual plot. But all the world building from the first book is vitally important for everything that comes after. And that includes the sequel duology, Endymion. Or I think it's a duology. It's Endymion and something. What was the second book in Endymion? I don't remember. My memory sucks. Getting old sucks. I've gotten worse with people's names. It's embarrassing. Are you really not gonna tell me? Cool beans. It is Endymion and the Rise of Endymion, which are titled after. Slide that in there without knocking all the other books off the shelf. There we go. Titled after Keats, John Keats' poems, Hyperion particularly, which deals with the fall of the gods, as it were. After that, and that's a major undertaking, that's going to take us months to get through the first 2 books, which are Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion. Then what was my? I think it was going to be getting into. Well, we're going to do something to as a palate cleanser. It might be another Greg Egan short story collection, which would wind up being instantiation if I'm doing this by chronological order. Or I might do something else entirely. And then we'll be getting to the 3-body problem by Xijin Liu, which I probably mangled the pronunciation of. I'm sorry. Anybody who has a better knowledge of Chinese name pronunciations can correct me at will, and I will accept that criticism freely. That's another thing. If you have critiques, critique away. Tell me about them, like in the comments section. I will try. I won't always promise to change my evil ways, but I will definitely at least read it and hear opinions, and either adjust or not adjust accordingly. I will come up with whatever justification. I'm not going to promise anything. I'll just say, tell me. And it's something, me knowing about it means something can change. If I don't know, then nothing can. The other one after that will probably be Destination Void by Frank Herbert, because somebody requested either the Jesus incident or the Lazarus effect. I don't remember which, but they are the next book along in that. Yeah, it's got to be the Jesus incident, I'm pretty sure, is what somebody had requested. I'd have to go through my comment section again to find it for sure. Um, and that's the sequel to Destination Void. It's separated by a substantial amount of time, as I recall, so it's not that imperative that I read the precursor book, but it kind of helps. I really dig Destination Void. Destination Void is another classic. It's really funny because it ties into how I kind of I can't go out and say mean things like the Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson Dune books are works of hacks or hackery. I can say that, but I shouldn't say that. Like if you read some of the stuff that's like a late timeline, I want to say it was like Hunters of Dune and whatever the one that came after that was. It's like there's a bunch of stuff lifted straight from Destination Void. Now, I'm not saying Frank Herbert himself wouldn't have gone there, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have been as contrived. The events contained therein wouldn't have been as contrived. Like some incredibly stupid things happen in those later books. It's like, really? Like really, really? Like you cock an eyebrow and you're like, really though? Really? Really, buddy? Come on. Have some class. Um, I'm not saying none of the events could have happened. It's just kind of like I think the way we could have gotten to the same end point, but I don't. But I think the path that we took to get there was inelegant. Um, let's say. Whereas Frank Herbert, I wouldn't say he's consistently elegant, but he had like particularly the Dune series, like working your way through the big four, Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune. There's like the evolution of that series through those four books in particular is wild, wild. And if you've read them, you know. If you've read them recently, you probably know even better. For me, it's been a while. Uh, I do, I am well overdue for a reread. Um, by well overdue, I mean only a couple years, not like a decade. I read them frequently, but I'm not gonna keep people delayed with that any more than I have already done. So with that, I'm gonna dip. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in. If you are watching this after listening, whatever, to this after the fact and have gotten this far, gosh, I am so sorry. Why would you keep listening to my blather? Seriously, what's wrong with you? But thank you. Um, I do stream these live. That's why they're rough. rough, 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 rough. Oh my god, are they rough? Downright barbed edges. Sandpaper even. It's not pleasant. No sorry, bub. No sorry, no sorry, boyo. Not pleasant at all. That's why these are rough, is because I'm doing these live, live, live in front of a live studio audience of whoever decided to tune in that day, starting at noon Eastern Standard Time. Around noon. It's usually a couple minutes late. I'll be honest. I'll cop. Mea culpa. I'm late. Starting around noon Eastern Standard Time every Friday on Free Read Fridays. With the change into the new year, I'm thinking of some changes to the format. I may start doing Saturdays as well. We'll be bringing Storytime Saturdays back, which I will use probably for like shorter form short story material. Um, I also have am thinking of doing swapping Wednesdays to wordy Wednesdays. I've already turned Wednesday into a float day anyway. I also have a bunch of mecha fiction. That is not MECCA, as in, you know, the Middle East, but MECHA, as in giant freaking robots, which usually has consisted of video games starring and involving giant robots. There's quite a lot of giant robot literature, and I will be reading some of it. I'm thinking of doing that starting this coming year as a change to the format. Because goodness knows I've got a lot of it. Probably the opener will wind up being the original novelization of Mobile Suit Gundam by Yoshiyuki Tomino and what's his name? Yaz. Does he get credited in here? Does Yaz get credited? Yaz, whose name I can't remember. Nah, it's just Tomino. Tomino's the one credited. And this is a translation from like the early aughts or 90s. When is this one from? 2004. I could have sworn it was older than that. Oh, the original publication was in 87, but the copy of my physical edition is from 84. I don't remember is from 2004. Sorry. So that one will be fun, especially to people who have watched the original source material. You'll have an interesting insight into how things could have also gone. Anyway, with that, I'm gonna dip, and yeah, see you all next time. Or not, because, this is a one-way thing, I guess, other than people typing comments. Thanks again to people typing. Yeah, appreciate it. Have a good one. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. Until next time, bye.